In the fading centuries of Rome, long after her golden eagles had cast their shadows across continents, the air itself felt heavy, as if the very world sensed an age drawing to a close. The marble streets that once echoed with triumph now carried whispers of uncertainty. Hunger crept through the provinces, plagues dimmed the population, and corruption hollowed the institutions that once held the empire together. For centuries, Rome had called itself eternal. But nothing eternal ever trembles, and Rome was beginning to shake. And so the empire trembled. The division of East and West had created two worlds. In the East, Constantinople glittered with wealth, its walls and gold shielding it from the storms gathering beyond. In the West, however, the storms had already arrived. Towns emptied, farmland failed. The legions, once ironclad symbols of Roman might, now struggled simply to exist. Many soldiers were no longer citizens of Rome, but hired foreigners, loyal only to the gold they were promised. And the gold itself was running out. At the empire's edges, entire nations were moving. The Goths, the Vandals, the Franks. And pushing them all, like a thunderhead rolling across the horizon, was a force unlike anything Rome had ever known. The Huns. But the story of collapse is never sudden. It begins with choices, mistakes, and warnings ignored. The first great warning came in the year 376, when tens of thousands of Gothic refugees appeared at the Danube, begging for sanctuary from the terror of the Huns. Compassion guided Emperor Valens to accept them. Greed guided his officials to exploit them. Rome starved the very people it had sworn to protect. And starving men, cornered and desperate, do not stay obedient for long. The Goths revolted, and Rome marched out to meet them. In 378, at Adrianople, the empire believed it could crush the rebellion quickly. But the battlefield became a grave. Roman formations collapsed under the weight of Gothic cavalry, the sky filled with smoke, screams, and the splintering of shields. By nightfall, 2/3 of the Roman army lay dead. Emperor Valens himself perished, burned alive in a farmhouse, or slain amid the chaos. No one knows for certain. What is certain is that Rome had not suffered a defeat like this in centuries. The world changed in a single afternoon. Rome survived, yes, but it survived wounded. Something deep within the empire cracked that day, something that had long held the world in order. And though peace was eventually negotiated with the Goths, it was a peace of necessity, not confidence. Every Roman leader knew it. Every soldier in the diminishing legions knew it. And beyond the horizon, the footsteps of barbarian armies grew louder. Power was slipping, and the empire's grip weakened each year. The West clung to its fading glory, convinced it could still command obedience by the memory of its past. But memories do not command armies. Memories do not stop invasions. Memories do not save empires, and so the empire trembled. In the decades that followed Adrianople, Rome tried desperately to pretend the world had not changed. Treaties were signed, titles exchanged, and senators insisted that the empire was still unshaken, still eternal. But beneath the surface, the foundations were eroding. Every year, the treasury grew thinner. Every year, generals feuded while enemies gathered strength just beyond the frontier. Every year, the empire lost another piece of itself. Barbarian groups, once dispersed and unorganized, began forging identities, nations born from necessity. The Visigoths, hardened by hunger and war, marched through the Balkans under the leadership of Alaric, a man who had once fought as Rome's ally, but had never forgotten Rome's broken promises. He wanted justice, he wanted recognition, but when Rome offered neither, he wanted something far more dangerous. He wanted Rome's submission. Inside the imperial palaces of Ravenna and Milan, panic brewed behind closed doors. The Western Empire had emperors, yes, but not leaders. Young rulers were manipulated by ambitious generals. Seasoned politicians clung to titles that no longer carried power. The one man who briefly held the West together, the brilliant general Stilicho, was eventually executed in a swirl of paranoia and political betrayal. Rome killed its greatest defender, and in doing so, opened its gates to fate. With Stilicho gone, the legions grew restless. Thousands of barbarian soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to him now felt abandoned by the empire. Many defected to Alaric. Rome's enemies strengthened with every mistake Rome made. By the early 5th century, Alaric stood on the Italian frontier, no longer begging for fairness, demanding it. He did not seek to destroy Rome, not at first. He wanted land for his people, a place in the world, and the honor he believed Rome owed him. But negotiations faltered, pride interfered, misjudgment reigned. And as winter winds swept across Italy, Alaric led his armies into the heart of the empire. The roads that once carried triumphant Roman legions now carried Visigothic warriors. Town after town fell or surrendered. The empire was too fractured, too exhausted to resist. Rome, the city that once commanded nations, was left nearly alone. In 410 AD, for the first time in 8 centuries, an enemy army stood before the walls of the Eternal City. Inside, famine devoured the population. Wolves roamed the outskirts. The Senate pleaded for mercy, but Rome had forgotten mercy long before Alaric arrived. Negotiations stumbled once more. And then, in the dark hours of the night, the Salarian Gate was opened, by slaves, by traitors, or by desperation. History is unclear, but what followed is undeniable. Visigothic warriors poured into the Eternal City, the streets filled with the roar of conquest, the crackle of flames, the cries of a civilization realizing it was no longer invincible. Though Alaric ordered churches spared and avoided wholesale slaughter, the psychological blow was devastating. Rome had fallen. Not the empire, not yet, but the myth of its eternity shattered in a single night. The world gasped, and so the empire trembled. The sack of Rome in 410 did not end the empire, but it ended an illusion. The Eternal City had been breached. The symbol of Roman power had proven vulnerable. Across the Mediterranean world, shock rippled like a tremor before an earthquake. Some believed it was a sign of divine punishment. Others believed it was simply the beginning of something far worse. The Western Empire staggered forward, wounded, but not yet dead. New emperors rose, some children, some puppets, none possessing the authority Rome once commanded. The Senate clung to tradition, even as the world shifted beyond its marble halls. And outside the borders, new kingdoms were forming from the ruins of Rome's old alliances. The Vandals crossed the Rhine, sweeping into Gaul and then into Spain. Violence, famine, and refugee crises followed in their wake. Roman territories, once tightly woven together like threads in a tapestry, began to fray. One province after another slipped from Rome's grasp. What the empire could not defend, others claimed. Then came the most devastating blow, the loss of North Africa. The Vandal king Gaiseric crossed the sea and seized Carthage, Rome's grain basket, the heart of its wealth. With Africa gone, the Western Empire lost not only food, but the revenue that had sustained its armies. Without coin, legions vanished. Without legions, borders collapsed. And without borders, Rome began to dissolve. Yet even as the empire weakened, a new horror rose from the plains of Central Europe. A force that united tribes under one banner, forged not by diplomacy, but by fear. A storm on horseback, the Huns. And leading them was a man whose name struck dread from Constantinople to Gaul, Attila. Under his command, the Huns carved a path of destruction across the continent. Cities burned, kingdoms bent the knee, entire peoples abandoned their lands rather than face the fury of his warriors. The Eastern Empire paid enormous tributes just to keep Attila at bay, but the West, poor, fragmented, leaderless, had nothing left to offer. In 451, Attila's forces surged into Gaul, threatening to crush the remnants of Roman authority once and for all. But fate delivered one final moment of defiance. Roman general Flavius Aetius, a man raised among the very barbarians Rome once feared, forged a desperate alliance with the Visigoths, the same people who had sacked Rome only decades before. Enemies became allies because survival left them no other choice. At the Catalonian plains, one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world erupted. For a moment, the ground beneath Gaul seemed to shake with the weight of history. The Romans and their allies halted Attila's advance. Not a victory of domination, victory of survival. Attila withdrew, but the empire's reprieve was fragile. A year later he returned, marching into Italy. Cities emptied before him. Refugees flooded south. The empire braced for annihilation, until fate intervened once more. Attila met with Pope Leo I, and within days he turned back. Whether it was diplomacy, illness, famine, or superstition that stopped him, no one truly knows. But Rome, though spared, was now living on borrowed time. The Hunnic storm faded soon after Attila's death, but the damage was irreversible. Power vacuums formed. Barbarian leaders rose. Roman authority shrank into isolated pockets. The West was dying, slowly, inevitably, and so the empire trembled. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow stretched thin across a dying world. Its emperors changed so quickly that even loyal citizens struggled to remember their names. Real power rested not in the gilded palaces of Ravenna, but in the hands of generals, and even they were often foreign-born warlords, commanding armies that barely resembled Rome's ancient legions. Still, the empire clung to life. Fragmented provinces tried to govern themselves. Local commanders made alliances without imperial approval. Diplomacy, once Rome's sharpest political tool, became desperate bargaining. The empire was no longer directing history, it was reacting to it. Amid this chaos rose one final figure, Orestes, a Roman general determined to place his own bloodline on the throne. In 475, he overthrew the reigning emperor and crowned his son as ruler of the West. The boy was named Romulus Augustus, an echo of the empire's first king and its first emperor. A name that carried centuries of legacy but none of its power. To the world, he was Romulus Augustulus, the little Augustus. But titles could not disguise reality. The empire he now ruled had shrunk to almost nothing. Italy, parts of southern Gaul, and a few scattered cities. That was all that remained of Western Rome. Beyond these fragments, barbarian kings ruled in the empire's former provinces, wearing Roman titles but answering to no one but themselves. And among those kings stood Odoacer, leader of the Germanic foederati, soldiers who had once fought under the Roman banner but now demanded what the empire could no longer give: land, payment, dignity. When Orestes refused their demands, rebellion ignited. In 476, the Foederati marched under Odoacer's command. Orestes was captured and executed. Ravenna, the last imperial capital, fell within days. And soon after, Odoacer confronted the young Romulus Augustus. No battle, no bloodshed, just the quiet, heavy inevitability of history. Romulus was ordered to lay down the imperial insignia, the purple cloak, the diadem, the scepter. Symbols that had once commanded the world now rested in the trembling hands of a boy forced to give them away. And with their surrender, the Western Roman Empire officially ended. No grand explosion, no final heroic stand, just a quiet transfer of power. A child emperor spared and sent into comfortable exile, and a barbarian king rewriting the meaning of Rome. But the fall of the West was not the end of Rome itself. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, endured for nearly another 1,000 years. Its culture, its laws, its influence would continue to shape the world. Rome did not vanish, it transformed. Yet in that moment, in the year 476, when the last emperor of the West bowed his head, the world felt the weight of an age closing. Roads built by ancient hands cracked, statues weathered, and the civilization that had called itself eternal finally surrendered to time. And so the empire trembled, and then it fell.